So I'm in conversation with Mark MacDonald, and Mark is a bishop in the Anglican Church, and I'm going to let him describe what that means. He is a First Nations person, and we're talking today about the meaning and the nature of place and land. But before we go there, Mark, you're a bishop, but you're a particular kind of bishop. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
I am the National Indigenous Anglican Bishop. That means that I have a pastoral and episcopal relationship with all of the Indigenous congregations and indeed all Indigenous people within the Anglican Church of Canada, which is, I'm the first person to have this position. I am now 10 years into my work. We have tried to structure the life of the Indigenous presence within the Anglican Church of Canada more by an Indigenous understanding of identity, of relationship to the land. We're still trying to articulate that and then to live by it in a practical level.
And you yourself come out of a particular, or belong to a particular First Nations tribe, nation. Can you describe a little bit of your own background?
Well, my tribe of note is the Wyandot people. That's my grandfather's people, and but I grew up in northern Minnesota among Ojibwe people, and I've spent a lot of time there. I also was the Bishop of Alaska for 10 years, in which I worked with Inuit people and the other Indigenous nations of Alaska, and more particularly and more decisive in terms of my thinking and identity. I lived in Navajo land for 5 years, have maintained a ongoing relationship with that area and with its spiritual teachings, and for a while was their stand-in bishop while they were in between bishops. So that's a little bit about my context and background. I've spent most of my adult life living in Indigenous communities and doing work in an Indigenous context.
And just say a little bit about how you came to become an Anglican priest and bishop.
Okay. Well, I grew up in the Episcopal Church in the United States, and although my family was not actively involved, they were nominal members. It nevertheless had some impact on me and shaped my thinking. After a very troubled time in my teenage years, I had a strong experience of conversion and discipleship that reaffirmed my relationship with Christ, most importantly. But as a gradual part of that process, I became established in an Anglican context and felt most comfortable expressing my Christian life and discipleship in that context. As a result of that, when I experienced a call to ordain ministry, I went to Wycliffe College in Toronto, and as I worked through my identity and sense of belonging, I gradually became more and more convinced that the place to express my calling and my discipleship was in the Anglican Church.
Neato. So when we talk about land and place, particularly amongst First Nations peoples, we're entering, when I say we, I'm clearly white Anglo-Saxon. we're entering a very different understanding and relationship to land and place, which I want to invite you to talk about, because my overall relationship to land and place is both real estate that I own and happen to live in, a resource for my retirement, or it's a nostalgic remembering of where I grew up as a kid in another land. I wonder whether you could begin to describe something of the understanding and the relationship to place and land amongst First Nations peoples. Are they the same thing or different things? But just talk a bit about that, Mark.
Okay. What immediately comes to mind is the Ojibwe word to describe male elders, akawenzi. It means the caretaker of the land. And it's an indication, and I'll say more about that term aki, which is for land, in a minute, but it's an indication that as someone grows, as someone matures, and someone develops, in terms of their spiritual and moral significance, the relationship to the land is critical, so that identifying someone as taking care of the land is the primary significance for age, and the purpose of life and age is this moral spiritual relationship to the land. I think that the term aki, land, describes something that is quite a bit different than the way land is used in Western societies, the concept. It appears to me that the land, the idea of land in Ojibwe and other indigenous languages has more to do with what we might call ecosphere. All of the relationships within a particular place that create and sustain life. These relationships are considered holy and important, and they determine the moral and spiritual framework in which people live and move and operate. So in the Ojibwe translation of John 3:16, it says, "For God so loved the land," Aki, "for God so loved the land that he gave his only begotten son." The idea the idea there being that the land itself has this kind of moral, spiritual significance. It is lovely and pleasing to God. The Isaiah 6, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God of hosts, heaven and the land are full of your glory." The idea that land itself reflects a type of relationship that is essential to life and essential to the development of moral and spiritual capacity and significance.
Now, in that context, say a little bit about one has to here talk about the reality that what is often called settler colonialism,
yes,
which is another way of saying white Europeans who are now called, in our case, Canadians, in
Yeah.
a large sense,
Yeah.
who formed a nation state, came with a radically other understanding of land, of space, which in shorthand is real estate.
Yes. Yes.
And talk a bit about the impacts that's had upon First Nations peoples, because here are radically different imaginations about the world and the place in which we live.
Yes. Well, that's good. It would be difficult to overstate the impact of Western notions of land and land ownership on the relationship with with Indigenous peoples. It's I think some would argue that that is the crux of the matter in the relationship and the difficulties in the relationship. And certainly the conflict over Indigenous rights is in many respects a conflict over land and what land means. The way in which Indigenous people have been dispossessed of their relationship to the land and at so many levels, including the ability to care for people and community in subsistence hunting and life. All of these things have been caused by this conflict between the indigenous notions of land and what it means, and the Western concepts of land and what it means. It seems to me that this conflict is a defining conflict in terms of that relationship, and it is, I think, part of the alienation that is going on between Indigenous people and the larger society.
There is a, certainly here in Canada, although I would assume it has meaning and implications for the United States, and a good deal of our audience are also European, United Kingdom. But it seems to me that in this particular part of the world, the ways in which the Canada as a nation, with an understanding of land as contract and real estate, has sought to engage with First Nations people around what is called a nation-to-nation relationship.
Uh-huh.
But inside of those notions of nation, particularly from the dominant white culture, are notions of real estate, ownership, and resource.
Right.
And so nation-to-nation conversation, in some ways, if I'm listening to you, is missing the point.
Right.
The much deeper question is one of what you've called ete, or land.
Yeah, it is. I think that although nation to nation has been a very helpful way of speaking about the relationship from an Indigenous point of view, there's all sorts of mischief hidden in it, in that so much of nationhood, from a Western point of view, is tied up in a particular set of concepts regarding land and ownership. And these concepts do not speak well to the to either the traditional notions of land and its relationship to peoplehood, on the one hand, nor does it relate well to the circumstances that indigenous people have been placed in by the conflicted and troubled relationship with indigenous people and with Western society and government and culture. So we're not just dealing with a pristine situation in terms of indigenous relationship to the land. We're dealing with the results of really centuries of policy that alienate indigenous people from that relationship with the land, or attempts to alienate indigenous people from the land, and to minimize their to minimize the depth of that relationship and its importance. All of this within the Western framework of land and law.
I want to come back to that. I think there's some critical questions to tease out there. In order to do that, I'm interested in your comment that in the reading that I've been doing, there's a conversation about how First Nations peoples can resist the overpowering reality of the white Euro-tribal narrative. And inside that, the resistance, it seems to me, if I'm reading it correctly, is a continual living into and a recovery of relationship with land.
Yes.
Could you say a bit more about it's the thing I hear words are both resistance and a resurgence of identity, all embedded in this notion of land.
Yes. Well, there's a number of ways in which that conversation could go. I think one of the things that I find most significant is the relationship between land and healing in indigenous thought. So I've been in conversations with a number of indigenous leaders over the past few years in which the Western definitions of health and well-being and healing are challenged specifically on the relationship to the land, so that indigenous people who have been lifted out of their relationship to the land and set in a Western therapeutic system continue to show problems afterwards. And I hear elders saying this is fundamentally about that primal and primary relationship to the land, which identifies indigenous people and heals indigenous people. So there is no healing apart from the land, they would say. I've heard that said in a number of contexts. So what does that mean? It means it means at an attitudinal level. It means that a heightened awareness, a growing awareness, a moral and spiritual commitment to that fundamental relationship to the land on the part of indigenous people, individually and collectively. But it also means going out on the land. So we're finding that more and more schools are trying to integrate going out on the land to their educational offerings and seeing that as a significant critical aspect of who they are. Some First Nations are encouraging their people to engage with the land, to be a part of the land. This is seen as essential to maintaining the strength and sovereignty of indigenous people relative to the ongoing onslaught of Western culture, its ideas, and its structures.
So there's something going on in your descriptions that I wonder whether you'd want to make explicit, which is that we're talking about a particular kind of relationship to the land, to play.
Yes.
Implicit in that, if I'm hearing you right, is that in your narrative, land is not inert, it's not matter, it's
Right.
not resource. Somehow it's alive.
Yes.
Somehow it is, how would I say it? It is a being
Yes.
that you have to be in relationship with. Am I hearing that correctly?
That's absolutely correct. There is, I'm not sure exactly how to characterize it, but there is I guess you would say, a personalism in the way in which indigenous people relate to the land. It is, it has identity and personality, and different ecospheres, if you will, different lands have different personalities and different relationship to the people around it. It's not uniform. It's not. It's the relationship to locality is the defining element in terms of indigenous identity and well-being, according to the elders that I've talked to about it.
So, I mean, from a Christian perspective, theologically, it is saying that creation is alive.
Yes.
Creation, God is as much, God's spirit is as much present and infused and working in and through land as God's spirit is present and infused amongst us as human beings, and
Yes.
that this is a deep relational engagement. I think that's what I'm hearing you
Yes.
describing.
I think very much so, and I would also see it as a recovery of what I see implicit in Scripture in terms of the multifaceted relationship between human beings and creation. So it seems to me that much of Christian thought has been so influenced by Western concepts of land that are, in terms of legal understanding, and the impact of a kind of mechanistic, materialistic view of the land through the lens of a particular understanding of land that that has diminished and distorted a Christian understanding of what land is, and what and the significance, the moral and spiritual significance of our relationship to that land around us. So to me, indigenous people, and I think Pope Francis points to this in Laudato Si, his encyclical on the environment, helps us to recover and uncover a kind of implicit environmentalism in the Christian tradition, and at the very least, whatever that may be. At the very least, I think it points to the distorting limitations of a Western concept of land. It seems to me that the West itself is finding it impossible to enter into a flourishing of life, communal and individual, under the within the reduced limits of what land means in a Western framework. So it seems to me that the West's view of land, which solves a particular set of legal and economic problems, creates a huge number of problems in that it reduces that relationship to a point where it's not morally, physically, or spiritually sustainable. And I think that it's demonstrated that it's created a capacity to destroy the earth in its inability to articulate the full dimensions of what it means to be a human being on the land, in the land.
I wonder then, if I could go back to your description of how in these Western nations, these Western relationships with Western states, you talk about the ways in which they have sought to minimize First Nations people's relationships in the way you've described it to land.
Yes.
I wonder, I haven't thought about this, but I wonder how can a white nation not afford not to minimize? Because if you lift up this relationship that you're describing and you begin to engage it, which is a deeply Christian understanding of creation, if you begin to lift that up and take it seriously, it fundamentally undermines the very basis of modern Western societies.
Yes.
Am I overstating that?
No, I think that's right. I think that's right. And I would say that at some point in time, regardless of if Western culture, Western society, the growing global culture of money, if it attempts to ignore this difficulty within its system, the consequences are corrosive in terms of their impact on society's capacity to operate and our future in terms of sustainability.
One of my responses, it's initially emotional, not on that, but it's important, is that, but we are a society whose roots for the last 300 or 400 years have been shaped by capitalism and by what we currently call neoliberalism.
Yes.
And the only way capitalism can thrive is by turning land, as you describe it, into resource commodity for extraction and for use.
Yes.
And alienating language. And so I'm not asking for answers here, I'm asking for conversation, but the question that bubbles up is, how do we engage this? Because for me, as a white European who owns real estate, it sounds like I got to give all this up. You understand what I'm trying to get at here?
Yeah.
But and I don't want to pound you with a pile of questions, but I think what you're describing is right. That the very notion of healing isn't something that I can get dealt with at a therapist. It is about being rooted and grounded. It's about a radically different understanding of land.
Yes.
How do these conversations take place? Where do you see them potentially taking place, Mark?
Well, I see them taking place in multiple venues. I think we're seeing some evidence, pretty minimal yet, that this is going to have an impact on the legal tradition, in the sense that people are beginning to speak about the environment, the land, rivers, having rights, defining the land in such a way that it has rights. I listened to a program on NPR the other day, in which they were talking about the concept of rights, of the rights of personhood, applying to animals. Specifically, they were talking about elephants.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to me that these conversations are pointing out the moral and spiritual limitations of the Western concept of land, and so and raising it in a venue that has some impact on how these things are being. But I think from a Christian point of view, we have to articulate, and I think that's what Pope Francis was trying to get at. We have to articulate the ancient sources of our understanding of humanity's relationship to the universe and to God. We have to re-articulate in such a way that we restate for a modern world a more fully orbed conception of what human life means in relationship to others. It seems to me that these conversations, which are happening philosophically, legally, morally, religiously, that these conversations are where this is going to be brought forward. My concern, my fear, has to do with the timing of it, because it seems to me that we should have had this conversation a number of decades ago.
Mm-hmm.
That we're facing a crisis in terms of the capacity of this legal cultural system, based as it is upon this unhappily limited view of humanity and its relationship to creation. It seems to me that this is threatening our future in a way that it's moving so quickly that one wonders whether we will have the time to re-articulate these things in a way that is saving, in a way that is healing. So we need to be about it. That's for sure.
Yeah, and part of the ways of being about it are, if I hear you right, of asking, how do we reconnect with stories that come from before the modern period?
Yes.
In terms of Christian imagination and identity.
Yes.
And that really takes me to something that has struck me about the reading I've been doing amongst First Nations peoples, is that your community continually talks about its elders.
Yes.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but and your elders, it seems to me, have some kind of deep understanding that it's their responsibility to carry and embody amongst themselves the stories of the land,
yes,
and its past and its livingness and our relationship with it.
yes,
In other words, it seems to me what I'm wrestling with is that for reasons I don't understand, your people have endowed in your elders something that goes back a very, very long way.
yes,
When I think of the elders of the white Euro tribal churches,
uh-huh,
now I'm 71, so I might be close to that.
yes,
We,
uh-huh,
we are so embedded, we are so shaped by this modern notion of land as commodity, of kind of rational actions and agencies,
uh-huh,
that sometimes I ask the question, how do we find and become the kind of elders that we need to be to create the conversations with across peoples that no longer minimize these kinds of realities?
yes,
Am I making sense? I'm going to ask you to answer the
yes,
question.
yes. Well, but what in my mind, what has been very, very important is the question of spiritual formation. And it seems to me that uh, we have to begin by admitting that all of us have been deeply impacted by the spiritual formation that has happened in the broader culture, the culture of money.
Right.
And to be there's various levels of that. There's counter forms of spiritual formation that happen in places like indigenous communities, and one would hope that they happen in Christian communities. But it seems to me that the uh, most of the Christian communities allow the fundamental spiritual formation, meaning the imagination, the ideals, and ethics of, of, of their people, allow that to happen with outside of the religious community, with outside of the spiritual community. There has to be an attempt, communally, I think, to shape in a countercultural way the imagination, the values, the ideals of uh, our Christian community. And it seems to me that that's fundamental to creating elders. Um, it, it, um, it, it will help to look at older people and people of wisdom and age, people who embody the ideals of our community. It will help to look at them in a different way, inspired by the indigenous example.
Mm-hmm.
But I think um, that will fall short until and unless we see a recommitment to forming and shaping indigenous, non-indigenous and indigenous people alike uh, in this renewed understanding of what land is from a moral, spiritual, uh, uh, pre-modern understanding.
Mm-hmm. And perhaps I'm not, I'm just going to make this is just an asterisk here that perhaps another stage would be a conversation together around what might be some experiments on the ground in which we could start to do that.
Yes.
But that's another conversation.
Yeah.
I want to ask a final question.
Uh-huh.
As I think about a lot of people who would potentially be listening to this.
Uh-huh.
There and some of this is generational, but a lot of people now would say, this all sounds good, but we're urban.
Yeah.
And land doesn't feel or sound very urban. And so what tends to get put over this is nostalgia, this is ideal, but it's not real. And yet, how do we speak this into an urban world, which in many ways has almost wrapped an insulator around this sense of land and belonging? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's an essential point. The the Pueblo people who live in the southwestern part of what is called the United States. The Pueblo peoples live in urban lifestyle within a context of a fiercely environmental point of view, so that they continue to have that indigenous understanding of the relationship of humanity to the land within an urban context. So it certainly says it's possible to be urban and to have this spiritual understanding of the relationship of people to land. What I think is going to happen is, to a certain extent, is happening, a renewed understanding of the relationship of land to people who live in an urban environment. I was with a Navajo elder in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we were overlooking the area of where the Minnesota and the Mississippi rivers come together.
Mm-hmm.
And I had I was pointing it out, and there was quite a bit of industrial development. There were a couple of freeways that you could see, cars moving to and fro. So I asked the elder what he thought of it, and he said it's beautiful. And I was kind of surprised, because I expected some more critical comment. And he said it's beautiful, the way the rivers come together and produce life, the way in which people are able to move to and fro to create a good life for their family. The way all of these things come together, this is a sacred place, a sacred place where people can live and operate in this way. And he even pointed out that he knew that there was nearby one at the time the largest mall in the world. so he used that as a way of talking about this understanding of land and in an urban environment. So to me, it seems that essential to urban life and reality is reacquainting urban dwellers with the land that was there before that happened, and the critical character of that land, meaning that the urban area wouldn't be possible without that initial and primary relationship. So it's a rediscovery, an uncovering of the reality of the land that lives underneath the urban experience.
That's an invitation into stories that lie waiting to be recovered again.
Yes.
And a way, one simple way at least, of not minimizing the realities of First Nations peoples in their lives. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for your wisdom and for your willingness to share what are some incredibly challenging issues, particularly for us in a dominant white culture. I sit with you and agree with you. Unless we change, there's no hope.
Yes.
Thank you for the hope that you've given and the stories.
Thank you.
Really appreciate
Thank you.
it. Thank you so much.
Okay.